I'm here today with Laura Alary. Laura has two new books coming out. The first is titled Sun in My Tummy, and the second is The Astronomer Who Questioned Everything. Laura is a writer, storyteller, and religious educator. When she was a little girl, she used to make her own books out of manila paper, crayons, and mucilage. These early efforts at writing eventually gave way to academic papers and theses, as she earned a bachelor's degree in classics, an MDiv, and a PhD in New Testament. More recently, Laura is focused on a new type of education, raising three creative and curious children. She leads workshops on everything from storytelling to biblical interpretation, teaches the occasional university course, and works with children at a local congregation. She's also returned to her early love of creating her own books, including Is That Story True? And Mira and the Big Story. Laura lives in Toronto, and you can learn more at lauraalary.ca. That's lauraalary.ca. So Laura, thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations on everything that you're doing.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, I was really glad that we got introduced through Brian McLaren, and we've all been collaborating together now, so that's a wonderful thing. So before we get into your books, though, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your background?
Sure thing. You covered a little bit of it there. I was born and grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I went to university there as well. Moved to Toronto when I was just about 22, I guess, to go to seminary. But I think my strongest sense of place, even now, is in the Maritimes, both Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, where I spent many, many summers. You mentioned I studied classics as an undergrad. I've always loved ancient Near Eastern history, and I have this secret hope that someday I'll publish a book that's related to ancient Egypt. But I've tried, but I haven't got the right story yet. Yeah, I completed a PhD in New Testament, and then I was at a crossroads. I convocated one November, and then the following month, my first child was born. Mm. And I was at that place where some of my colleagues were as well, and some of them took one road, which was to follow that academic path. I decided I was going to stay home with my son, and then ended up having two more children and being home with them for 15 years. So yeah, that was a significant decision that I made in my life, and it's taken me perhaps places where I hadn't anticipated, but I'm content with where I am. So
very cool, wonderful. So I mentioned kind of in the intro that you started writing books, so to speak, at a very young age. But when did you really decide to write books for a more permanent audience?
Yes. Okay. So that's actually related to the whole doctoral work thing. Because when I was younger, I wrote for pleasure. I kept a journal. I made these little books. I had several rather poor attempts at starting novels that didn't go anywhere, but I still had a lot of fun with it. And then I spent many, many years at post-secondary education doing academic writing. And the other kind of writing kind of faded away because there just wasn't time and energy to do it. And when I finished my thesis and defended it and went through all of those hoops, I realized with some dismay that my inner editor was kind of on hyperdrive, and I felt strangled. I was unable to write anything. I couldn't write a thank you note. I couldn't write in my journal. The words just wouldn't come.
Wow.
And that was really, I was really sad about it because I derived so much pleasure from writing, and it was such an important creative outlet for me. And I didn't know how to unlock it. At the time, though, of course, I had this infant son at home, and I was reading to him all the time. And I thought, well, rather than just give up on this entirely, maybe I'll try something completely different, and I will write a story just for him. So I did that. I thought nobody else has to see it. I squeezed out, 600 words or however long it was. And I was able to do it. And I thought, I think I'm going to I think I'm going to try this, because of course we were going to the library every week and hauling home bags and bags of picture books. And I was reading, it seemed like hundreds of them. And I thought, I've loved picture books my whole life. I mean, even as an adult, before I had children, I was still collecting them. And it just all of a sudden seemed like a natural thing to try to do. But as with many things in life, it's a lot more difficult to do it when you actually sit down to attempt it. And that first story that I wrote for him, I actually had an opportunity to share that with a real editor. And she said, I remember being on the phone with her, and she said to me, "You know how to use words," she said, "but there's nothing special about this." And it was an important moment for me in my journey as a writer, because it stabbed me, and I thought, this is from my infant son. Like, how can there be nothing special about it? And then I realized, okay, I'm in my little bubble here, and I need to break out of it. I also need to learn to take correction and criticism and just develop a thicker skin, because this is going to be, if I want to do this, this is going to be the first of many, many rejections. And that's been a constant process of learning for me. And one time I'd had a particularly hard rejection, and I was at an outdoor storytelling festival, and I went to meet an author whose work I admired very much. And I confess, I did a little bit of whining. I said, it's so hard. You put your heart out there. And she just looked at me, and I expected her to sympathize. And she said to me, "Well, if you're not brave enough to do it, somebody else will be." And I thought, whoa. But I've carried that with me ever since. And yeah, I love what I do, but it does take a certain kind of vulnerability, but also courage to keep putting your work out there.
Well, I hear that from so many authors, and I also hear from so many authors that writing children's books is way more difficult than most people who haven't done it think it is.
Yes, that's true.
So good for you for, persevering and sticking through it, because look at how many you've published now. So let's,
yeah.
So before we get into the new books, let's talk about your previous ones. What all, did you release before this latest two?
Okay. Well, I'll start with my first one, which I have here. Is That Story True? This is a book about, the way stories can carry and convey truth, even if the events they describe or the events they narrate never happened. So that might sound really obvious, but at the time I was the idea was percolating. I was teaching a course on biblical interpretation. And I found myself moderating a lot of disputes about the historicity of certain biblical narratives, in particular the infancy narratives. So one of the things I love about the history of interpretation is the way that figurative reading, so more than literal, is such an essential part of the tradition. Over the centuries, though, especially the last couple of centuries, we've lost a lot of that flexibility by tying the meaning and the significance of text so tightly to their ability to refer accurately to history. So that doesn't sound like a very likely topic for a picture book. But I know from my own experience and from having young children that children understand intuitively that stories have power as stories, not because they tell you what actually happened, but because they connect with something that you can just feel is true in you. So I decided to write this book about a little girl called Maggie and her mom, and they sit down every night and they read stories before bed. And they're always different kinds of stories. But every night Maggie says, "So is that story true?" And then she and her mom talk about what that might mean for a story and the different ways a story can be true, even if it didn't happen. So as you might imagine, it was a bit of a challenge to find a publisher who is willing to take this on, because it sounds like a bit of an odd topic for a picture book. But Woodlake Books decided to take a chance on it. And that was what got me started. And after that, I published published a few others with Woodlake. And then they came to me and gave me an opportunity to do my biggest project, which you can just kind of, hope you can see in the background, Read
Yes.
One to Listen, Stories from the Bible for Young Readers. So that was, I think there's 105 stories in there.
Wow.
So it took me the better part of a year to write that. That was a huge endeavor and really significant for me because it brought together this new love of storytelling for children with my background in biblical studies. So that was important. And then another one that I'll mention, Mira and the Big Story. That one is, I guess it came out about 9 years ago, although it's being reprinted now. And it's significant for me because it's a story about stories. It's kind of a fable that talks about the way the stories we value and cherish and tell ourselves shape us and shape our relationships with other people and with the natural world. So it's kind of done in a folk tale style. There are two groups of people and they live on opposite sides of a river valley. They each have their own village. And each group has its own origin story or kind of creation story. You know, this is how we came to be in the valley. This is how this land was given to us. And in the beginning, those stories are good things, but then they kind of harden into this rigid literalism. And when they realize that the people on the other side of the river have a different story, they conclude that the others must be wrong. And then they become enemies. And then that grows into this conflict between them. The main character, Mira, is curious. And that's, it's a characteristic that I think is incredibly important. And it shows up a lot in my stories. So she's been taught to hate and distrust the others, but she's also very curious and wants to know more about them. So she actually crosses the river and she sees her own village from a different perspective. She ends up meeting a child from the other village, and that meeting causes her to question what she's been taught for her whole life. So she's both excited but also frightened and discombobulated. So she goes home and she asks a trusted elder and she says, "Are the stories wrong?" And so he says to her that stories have power. They can make us bigger on the inside. That's the tagline on my website. They can expand our hearts and our minds, but they can also make us smaller. So he says, "Mira, there's never going to be peace in this valley until people find a story that's big enough for everyone." And so he tells her the cosmic story. So the story of a universe that flared forth 14 billion years ago and tells us that we're all made of the same elements. So we share the same origins, essentially, and are intimately connected to one another and to other things. So those themes, curiosity, the sort of the cosmic story as the context for everything, this interconnection, those are themes that continue to draw me and they inform my writing now. So that book, even though it's 9 years old, it still continues to speak. I think certainly to me.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of adults can have a lot to learn from that. Yeah,
and it's neat. It keeps kind of taking on these new forms. There's an organization in the UK called Out of the Box for Schools, and it uses kind of a godly play style of storytelling combined with deep talk from Finland, and it tells these stories. Anyway, I was contacted by them, and they're turning Mira and the Big Story into one of their stories to be shared in schools, which is kind of cool just to see it evolve in new directions.
Sure.
So then I have some other books like Breathe behind me here. I have a series for the church year, Breathe, Look, and Make Room, written primarily for a Christian audience. And others are just kind of for anybody who wants to read them. What Grew in Larry's Garden here was my first book with a large mainstream trade publisher, and it came out just at the start of the pandemic. and it's being followed by others. So that one's published by Kids Can Press, and my new one, The Astronomer Who Questioned Everything, is Kids Can as well. So there's other things in the works. Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, I mean, you've done a ton. I mean, it's just impressive. So let's talk about the two new books. The first one I mentioned is Sun in My Tummy, which I know you don't have a copy of yet because it's that new. So I'm sorry that, you can't show it, but that's okay. We can certainly talk about it.
But you can show us yours so we know it exists.
Yes, yes. So what motivated you to write that book?
Well, I guess the catalyst for it was a question from a little boy named Andreas. And at the time I was working at a Montessori school, and we would have our meals there. So they were always catered. And the staff would sit at small tables with the students at lunchtime. So I was at this table with probably 5 or 6 4- and 5-year-olds. And Andreas said to me, "Miss Alary, where does our food come from?" And I don't know why I thought this, but for some reason I thought he was asking, like, he'd seen the catering truck maybe, and he was asking where in the city it had been brought from. And I clued in soon enough, and I realized that his question was a whole lot bigger than that. And he really did not know where food came from. So I said, "Well, Andreas, have you ever been to a farm?" And he said, "Nope." And I said, "Well, have you ever been to the grocery store?" And yes, he had. So I said, "Well, have you ever wondered how the food got to the grocery store?" And he said, "No, I never really thought about that." So we played this little game, and we sat and we looked at what was on our plate. I think it was spaghetti. And we said, "Okay, what does it take to make spaghetti?" And we have flour and we have water. So then we just kept tracing those things back and playing this little game in our heads. And we traced it all back to the sun, basically, whose energy allows plants to grow. And then that's, cut down, and from the wheat, we get the flour. And I think the kids enjoyed that conversation, and I did too. And it reminded me of some other books that use that kind of connected thinking to help children show the processes that lie behind what's present in front of them. And so I went home, and I didn't do anything with it right away. I was just kind of letting it percolate. And then that summer, when I had a little bit more time, I was on my way to PEI, and I happened to be reading a book by Thich Nhat Hanh, and he was talking about eating mindfully. And particularly looking so closely, and I think that's the phrase he used, look so deeply into our food that we can see all of the elements that combined to bring it into being. And he has this beautiful blessing. He says, "In this food, or in this plate of food, I see the whole universe supporting my existence." And when I read that, it was kind of mind-blowing, because I thought, wow, like to walk through the world with that kind of awareness, where you look at something as ordinary as your lunch and you sort of peer deeply into it and see the whole universe. I just think that's awesome. So Andreas's question came back to me, and I thought I'd love to be able to convey this sense of wonder and awe to children in a way that makes sense and that's sort of child friendly. So I knew I'd have to do it in small steps. And anyway, what came out of it was this little book, Sun in My Tummy.
So in the book's description, it says the cooking of a healthy breakfast moves from parent-child bonding to an eloquent conversation about energy, the growth of plants, and the miraculous ways the sun's light nourishes us all. So to me, that sounded like, I wonder if that's something that actually happened in your family.
Well, yes and no. Well, first of all, there are elements of it that come from my own childhood, because my mom did almost all the cooking, but my dad made me porridge for breakfast every morning. So that's kind of where this whole idea of getting up and stumbling downstairs in the dark and coming into the brightly lit kitchen to the oats bubbling on the stove, that came from there. With my own kids, though, we used to go through this process at the table, where we would sit down together and do what I did with the children at the Montessori school, and kind of look at our food and say, okay, we want to say thank you for this food, but before we do that, let's think about everyone and everything that helped bring it to the table. So whether that's the person who planted it or harvested it or drove the truck to get it to the grocery store, or the clouds, the wind, the rain, the soil, the sun. So yeah, it was an exercise in gratitude that I used to do with my own children. And I think that informs the book, certainly.
Cool, cool. So you also have some author's notes at the end that kind of like share more information about photosynthesis and things like that. That sounds like that's an important aspect of your books, is to have some follow-on education for further reading, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, I actually love to do the author's notes. Sometimes they're really difficult. Like I've got a book in process right now about the astronomer Cecilia Payne. And oh my goodness, I sweated over those author's notes because there was science in them that I had to really struggle to learn and then to distill in a way that I could express so that it was still accurate but also made sense. So I love the author's notes because I think that they're a help for teachers and parents who want to perhaps take the conversation a little bit further. They're also, they expand the reach of the book a little bit. So a book like Sun in My Tummy, I'd have to check some of the online listings to see what the recommended age range is. I think it's probably 4 to 8. But you could read that book to a very young child and just give them just the first taste of the amazing things that green plants do for us. And that would be enough. But then if you read it with older children, you could use the author's note and you could expand that and you could talk a little bit more about what photosynthesis is and the role it's played in the evolution of our planet. Because I do get into that just a little bit. It just, I think it makes the book a little bit more usable, both for children of a wider age range and also for teachers and parents. And Sun in My Tummy, I'm excited because it's going to have a teaching guide that's going to come along with it.
Good.
Yeah.
I think that makes a ton of sense, what you were just describing in terms of expanding the usefulness of the book, no question. Mm-hmm. So let's move on to the second one, The Astronomer Who Questioned Everything. How did that book happen?
There she is. Well, I've always loved biographies. I just adore stories about people's lives, whether that's major historical figures or just people that I meet. I'm somebody who loves listening to other people's family histories. So even if you're at a family reunion and I'm not even related to anybody, I still love to hear people talk about where they came from and who's related to whom. Anyway, so I also love the history of science, particularly lesser known contributors who are often women, not always, but sometimes. So those things kind of combined. And I had never heard of Maria Mitchell, I confess, until I read a book called Figuring by Maria Popova. And Maria Mitchell is a fairly major figure in that book. So I was really interested in her as a person. And I started doing a little bit more looking. And I was drawn to a number of things about her. I loved her curiosity. I loved her frankness. She has this amazing intellectual courage and independence and this kind of tart sense of humor that I really resonated with. Now, Maria Mitchell once said, and I think this is what maybe drew me to her at this time, she once said, the hardest thing in life is knowing what to do. The doing of it is comparatively easy. And I think that resonated with me because I've always been the sort of person who's kind of struggled with my own vocation. I've wanted to do things that are purposeful and meaningful, but I haven't always been good at figuring out what those are. There are people who from the time they're very young sort of have their paths laid out, and that was not me at all. So I resonated with that statement, and I thought I'd like to know more about this woman, who she was, how she ended up where she did, And yeah, and I was also thinking about my own children who they're now teenagers and struggling to make decisions about university and courses and so on. And they're being, I have an 18-year-old son in particular, and I felt, okay, he's being pressed to say what he wants to do with the rest of his life. And I'm thinking, how can he possibly know that now?
Right.
And so I really loved the idea of this little girl kind of trying to find her way and gathering all of these things that she's fascinated by in the world and figuring out, well, what am I going to do with them? So that was the angle that I took on Mariah's story. I mean, you could take it's a whole life, right? How do you take someone's life and put it into 800 words? You need to choose your angle. So the angle that I chose was a young girl trying to discern how to use her curiosity and talents in a way that would be meaningful both for her and for others.
So was that aimed at a little bit older reader?
Yeah, I would say somewhat older. Now, it's still a 32-page picture book, but you can tell even from the amount of text that it's got a slightly older audience in mind than Sun in My Tummy. And it also has a fairly extensive, well, actually, I can show you because you don't have it there. It also has an author's note, but a more extensive one. So there's information here about Mariah, different aspects of her life. Goes on, well, 4 pages basically. So I'm hoping that maybe slightly older, whoops, okay, goodbye. The slightly older readers will turn to that and maybe find some inspiration there, but also that, again, teachers and parents might find that a useful launching pad for some of their discussion or lessons.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I know you've got some additional projects in the works beyond those two. Do you want to just briefly mention anything you can about those?
Anything I can, yeah. Well, I have another one coming out with Paraclete Press in the fall, and Paraclete published these 3, my Circle of the Church yearbooks. The one that's coming out, though, is quite different. It's called Here, the Dot We Call Home. And it's kind of a child's eye view of again, the cosmic story of what home means. Home in the immediate sense. It starts out with a little girl in her room and then walking through her house and slowly becoming aware of signs or evidence that people lived there before her. So, there's somebody who's put their handprint or footprint and initials in the sidewalk, in the cement outside. There's a little bit of graffiti on the fence. There's just these little hints that somebody was there before her. And she starts to think, oh, well, someday somebody else is going to live here. That's a really strange thought. And then she starts to stretch her concept of home further back and further out. So she's looking at her city and says, well, this is my home too. But then people lived here before me. And then looking at what they left behind, both what was good and what was bad. And then we keep zooming out and zooming out. In fact, when I first wrote the story, I was going to call it Zoom. And then everything changed. And all of a sudden the word has other connotations. So yeah, so that's coming out in the fall. I'm looking forward to that.
That's very cool.
And then, as I mentioned, I have another picture book about an English American astronomer, Cecilia Payne. It's coming out with Erdmann's. I don't actually have a release date for that one. And I have another one that I'm quite excited about. And it's, well, actually, I probably shouldn't say anything about it, except that it is related to, it's the story of a little boy who meets a soldier who is suffering from shell shock during the First World War. And again, it does not sound like a likely topic for a picture book, but I think it works, and I love the challenge of taking stories that don't obviously, leap out at
Sure.
you as picture book material and telling them in a way that is accessible and meaningful. So that one, it's in process, but we're kind of waiting for the illustrator. So yeah.
Wow. Well, you're just prolific. I mean, you're really productive.
Well, I do my best with the time that I have. I kind of consider myself to be a bit of a quilt maker. I take the scraps that are available and put them together. But yeah, I'm pleased and excited about what's coming.
Well, thanks so much for joining us and for telling us about all of these. Again, the two new books are Sun in My Tummy and The Astronomer Who Questioned Everything. And you can learn all about all of Laura's books at lauraalary.ca. So Laura, thanks again, and congratulations on all this wonderful work.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk.